Welcome to panel number 4, Professional Ethics. My name is Ben Coetzee. I'm a reader in philosophy of education at the University of Birmingham. Now, when Mira kicked us off this morning, she framed the conversation in a certain kind of way. She asked us, why do we have well-developed, well-established, successful codes of ethics and institutional ethics arrangements in other professions, but we don't have it in our field of education. So the last panel of the day, we've brought together 4 representatives from different professional fields to help us answer that question. I'll begin to introduce our speakers from way over on the left. Howard Gardner, who's Hobbs Research Professor of Cognition and Education here at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Welcome, Howard. David Wilkins, who is Lester Kissel Professor of Law and Faculty Director of the Center on the Legal Profession at Harvard Law School. Next to me, Catherine Peeler, who's Assistant Professor in Pediatrics at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, and present or past Safra Fellow, present Safra Fellow in Ethics. And lastly, very welcome to Ashley Lee, who's Fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Technology and the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, also here from Harvard. We've pulled the last session of the day. We'll get straight into it. And I've asked Catherine to start us off to speak about the situation in medicine and the history and influence of medical ethics in that field.
Sure, thank you. I'm gonna sit here, but I do have some notes. I apologize if I look down every once in a while. But so just to give you a little bit of background about me, so I am a pediatric intensive care physician at Boston Children's Hospital. So most of my ethics knowledge is in the day-to-day, kind of seeing patients and making kind of ethical decisions at the bedside. And in that way, I kind of came to think about it more academically. And so as Ben mentioned, I'm now at the Safra Center as well as at the Center for Bioethics, both here at Harvard. And so I just kind of want to talk a little bit about kind of how we came to have bioethics be so prominent in medicine. It's certainly not new, although I would say modern bioethics is kind of newer. So most people have heard the Hippocratic Oath, and we think about that a lot. In the public kind of sphere of how do doctors make decisions, are they good people? And that is very old, and some version of that has been recited at medical schools around the world, but particularly in the United States, for a very long time. But I would say the kind of more modern era of bioethics really started more so after World War II during the Nuremberg trials, and when it came to light all the things that Nazi physicians had been doing to various persons in terms of experiments, which I will say some of their techniques they learned from us, but that's a different talk. But during those trials, it essentially came to light that physicians do not always act in their patients' best interests, and maybe we should actually think about this more formally and codify how physicians should act and what their behaviors should be guided by. And so there were several principles that were outlined during those trials, during what we call the Nuremberg Code. And kind of the most important one that came out of that was the idea of voluntary consent of the human subject. And kind of shortly thereafter, we also had the Declaration of Geneva, where physicians came together and actually had a more new secular physicians code, where they kind of added that physicians must also not use their medical knowledge to be contrary to the laws of humanity. So not just doing good for one person, but also that we need to not harm others. And this was right before the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which had similar rights that we felt were important for all people. And during that time is when we started to see a lot more of these formal codifications, both of how to act as well as medical associations being formed. So there was the WHO, there was the World Medical Association, and all of these organizations started to codify kind of codes of medical ethics. And along the way, kind of other experiments were happening. So there was the experiments at Willowbrook, a school in the United States, where Dr. Saul Krugman had been doing experiments on disabled, developmentally delayed children and actively infecting them with hepatitis virus. The public learned about this and was outraged. There was, in the 60s, Shana Alexander published her very famous article in Life magazine talking about what was going on with these panels of private unnamed persons who were deciding who did and did not get dialysis. That caused a lot of uproar. Along the way, there were further kind of declarations. So there was the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964. This kind of clarified, whereas Nuremberg had said there needs to be voluntary consent, that had inadvertently kind of precluded children and other persons who can't provide consent from consenting. And so the Declaration of Helsinki kind of added other clarifications, such as the idea of surrogate consent, so that children and other persons could be in research. Kind of fast forward a little bit, we had the 1970s, the revelation of what had been going on in the US Public Health Service study at Tuskegee, which had been going on for many decades, but really only came to the public light in the 1970s when it was published, I think, by the Associated Press. And essentially it was found that the Public Health Service had been running this study for watching the natural history of what would happen to persons who had syphilis but did not receive care, which we knew at the time that the treatment was penicillin. It was available. It was not given to African-American persons who were watched with syphilis. And this also, around the same time, a few years later, led to the Belmont Report. And that, I would say, is kind of the main thing that most medical students learn about, and physicians. So this was the publication by the US National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects. And they essentially said that all research on human subjects has to have respect for persons, has to have an idea of beneficence, right? So you need to mitigate harm and also promote the welfare of both the subjects as well as those who you're trying to inform by this research. And there also needs to be an element of justice. This was really new to the idea of medical research. So not only can you not exploit persons, but you need to also, you can't just choose people because they're convenient. You have to really think about who you're choosing and why, if it's important to the research, as well as if it's going to benefit other people. And so where we are today, I would say, is that, so medical education today, all medical schools have a component of bioethics education. I certainly learned about bioethics in my education. I teach a lot of bioethics. There's courses that are required, and it's kind of everywhere. But it has really delved into different regions. And so there's clinical bioethics, where you can consult a bioethicist about a particular case. There is research ethics, which is really kind of where all this came from. And then I would say there's also now much more of a role of bioethics in the public sphere. So, most recently, the idea of, what to do in the light of Dobbs, right? So do physicians, and this will blend nicely into the idea of what to do legally, but do you decide to functionally act against the law in the favor of your patient? So if the ethical idea is that you need to save your patient's life or provide this service that you feel is important for the life of the mother or the baby, or it's the birthing person's right to decide, how do you act as a physician when the law is contrary to your ethical mandate, both by your professional association as well as your kind of internal compass as you've learned ethics in school? And so there is kind of a world of ethics that we could talk about, but I would say that really the way that bioethics came about was by understanding that physicians needed a code in which to act by, particularly in the light of what was happening in Nazi Germany, and also that really showed what was happening in the rest of the world, but had not really kind of come to the public sphere until that time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And you provided our introduction straight over to David, who's going
I'm not sure I'm going to be able to beat either that wonderful introduction, let alone the comprehensiveness of that discussion, or even the actual question I was asked but I warned Mira I might not do that. So I'll say this. This conference is about whether education ethics is a field. When I started teaching in 1986, it was clear that there was a field called legal ethics. What wasn't clear, whether it was actually an oxymoron or not, sort of like military music. And it was, and there was some indication that the president and former dean of Harvard Law School, Derek Bach, sort of thought that, because in 1987, he recruited recruited Dennis Thompson from the political science department at Princeton, where he served along with our friends Sandy Levinson, a relation, and to start something called the Program in Ethics in the Profession, which is now called the Safford Center. But the original name was, its original intent was basically a remedial ethical education for us benighted souls who were teaching professional ethics in professional schools. And I was one of those benighted souls, because actually I thought that of all the things Harvard Law School didn't prepare me for, actually being a lawyer and understanding what that meant was at the top of the list. And so I was actually teaching there, and I got, as a result, a one-year free pass to hang around with the legends who were roaming the earth at the time, who were a part of the program: Walzer, Rawls, Parfit, Nozick. It was Amy Gutman. It was a really incredible group. Francis Cam was my fellow, which was both thrilling and terrifying a little bit at the same time, if you know Francis. And Arthur Applebaum, who was the perennial fellow who was never allowed to graduate. And that experience was incredibly important to me in my development of someone who still teaches a course called The Legal Profession now, 36 years later, I'm embarrassed to say, because it allowed me to escape the origins of the field. And the origins of the field were either in a kind of ethics as law, right? Or ethics as kind of pious platitudes. And there's kind of been both as part of the field, and happy to talk more about it. Our origin story, certainly of the codes of professional ethics in a serious way, is Watergate, when the Attorney General of the United States, the counsel to the president, and several other high-ranking legal officials went to jail. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. And, you know, this later Justice Powell, who was the president of the American Bar Association, was horrified by that and thought that the perfect way to solve and make sure this would never happen again was to ensure that every law student took 2 credits of professional responsibility education, which is the only requirement outside of the first year. And so I often say I owe my job to Richard Nixon. But the fact of the matter is that became both a dreaded course for students who hated it, because it was mostly a course about increasingly technical and narrow and often self-interested rules, which were passing as ethics. And so what what is now the Safford Center and my exposure to legendary ethics teachers gave me was a perspective to think about legal ethics in perspective to what you might think of as, you know, real ethics, and in particular to ask the question that was asked over and over again, which is there any such thing as role morality? Is the role of the fact that you are a lawyer, does that affect what people ought to do? And this was vigorously debated, and Arthur wrote a brilliant piece about the executioner of Paris, which always made me feel as bad as lawyers were. We were never quite in that category. But I want to, in my last 3.5 minutes, I'm looking carefully at the clock, make a pitch for this field also having not only to learn from philosophy, but also to learn from sociology. And the fact of the matter is that lawyers, there are lots of different kinds of lawyers in lots of different places, and partly what was happening while I was teaching about this and why I realized this was the best course to teach, not the worst, was because it was about a profession that was dramatically changing. It was moving from individual practitioners and solo practitioners to institutionalized frames of practice, not just in kind of the fancy corporate law firm world, but the government lawyering world, the public interest world. And yet no one was talking about what's the relationship between the individual and the institution. It was moving from a profession in which, as I only half jokingly tell my students, anybody could be a lawyer before 1965. As long as they were a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant man of means, it was open to talent. But the fact was it was becoming increasingly diverse to the point where now it is what the sociologists would call a feminized profession. More than half the entrants are female, and around the world it's dramatically more than that. People of color, LGBTQ+, et cetera. And yet, the question is whether those forms of identity affect the way in which people ought to behave in certain kinds of circumstances, something that I learned, again, from my friend Sandy Levinson, who's sitting in the front row, who wrote a very brilliant piece about what he called bleached out professionalism, and whether there was actually something about professionalism to which the identity and deep commitments of people mattered. I think now I think a lot about not just the institutionalization, but the globalization of the profession and its implications for everything from technology, that's my handoff to you, to the ways in which people learn, that's my handoff to Howard. You know, I'll just say this in my last 1 minute, I think that I have, which is these questions are critically important because legal ethics not only has to be connected to what we think of as our duties as to each other as moral citizens, but it also has to do with our duties to political institutions and to citizenship. And anybody who's been watching the news today knows that lawyers can either be a force for good or a force for what my friend is now calling democratic backsliding. We have lawyers involved in illiberalism as well as the protection of liberalism and democracy. These questions are related to what lawyers think their roles are and how strongly they believe that their roles come with the kind of constraints and ethical obligations that you described as doctors. In fact, I begin my class with an old chestnut that has, it's called Spalding versus Zimmerman, and it has a lawyer and a doctor in it, and I always begin with the doctor, and the question is, what do we think about the doctor, and what implications does that have to the lawyer? So I'll stop here, but it's a plea to say, I think there, to the extent there is a field, that field has to be willing to confront or maybe reject, I would argue, the straightforward is-ought distinction that oftentimes is pressed in pure philosophical discussions about how people ought to behave.
Thank you very much, David, for that view on the legal profession. We'll take the second handoff you gave us and go to Howard, who's going to speak a little bit about the situation in education. And about the, not at all. And about
Is my amplification working? No. I will try to fix it or I'll shout.
You're like E.F. Hutton, Howard. We're all.
Is this better?
That's better.
Okay.
That's better. Thank you.
Okay. So I want to start by saying I've been to the entire conference, and I feel that I'm in an event which is potentially very important. And my hat's off to Mira and to her many colleagues and friends who put this together. It could turn out to have been an important event for this space, this school, and maybe for the broader society. My own interest in professions began almost by accident over 25 years ago when two colleagues and I, psychologists will know Bill Damon and Mike Csikszentmihalyi, and I decided to figure out what good work was. And we had the phrase, but we decided to talk to about 1,500 people, at least an hour each, and to see what they felt good work was. And after several years of data collection and several years of data analysis, we can summarize it very succinctly. Good work has three elements. It's excellent, it's engaged, and it's ethical. If I had a slide here, but I decided not to show it, imagine not a double helix, but a triple helix, and each one is a separate E: excellence, engagement, and ethics. And unless you have all three, you don't have good work. We, as I said, studied 9 different professions, and we discovered professions are quite different from one another. Here's something I wouldn't have expected, maybe you wouldn't as well. If you talk to people in teaching, nursing, medicine, social work, they think it's primarily about their relationship to the client. If you talk to people in journalism and law, they think it's about the relationship to facts and truth and getting things right. And we didn't tell them to say this, they told us. We also, and again, we didn't know this until we got into law, though David could have told us, that there are all kinds of different lawyers. And we actually spoke to small-town lawyers, corporate lawyers, defense lawyers, believe it or not, Ashley, cyber lawyers. Jonathan Zitrain helped us, and a few judges. And of course, these are different types of law. I would imagine small-town lawyers were much more interested in the individual person than corporate lawyers, but I don't remember that. I'm just making that up. But the important point here is that even when a profession has a single name, like law, there might be quite different hats being worn, and what's important for one kind of a lawyer is not important for other kinds of lawyers. Having been at this conference now for at least 24 hours, I went to the pre-conference. Education is all over the map. There are preschool educators, there are early childhood educators, there are high school educators, there are colleges, there are universities, professional schools, and of course, there are teachers, but there also are administrators, there are school boards, there are lawmakers, and I think it's probably safe to say that there isn't any arena in which more people feel they have a stake in education. You know the old joke, well, I went to school, so I know how to be a teacher. And so a real challenge when you're trying to launch a field like education ethics is what I would call the tent challenge, the tent challenge. Are you going to have one huge tent and everybody kind of has to be an ethicist within that tent? Or will you have a whole bunch of rather independent tents which might occasionally see one another but don't really have any contact? I think of AERA, which is the professional organization of most people here. Thousands of people go there, and you know, most people have no interest in 90% of the special interest groups. You know, they go to, you know, assessment of high school kids or training of principals or maybe training of principals in science, spelled differently. And yet, I don't think it would make sense to develop a educational ethics, an ethics of education, if it was all simply a number of separate tents which occasionally touch one another. So I think that the challenge for this incipient enterprise, are there some set of issues and some set of roles and some set of situations and some set of challenges which bring most educators closer to one another than they are to journalists or lawyers or doctors or nurses or the other professions that we looked at. And I don't think anybody, not even Mira, would know the answer to that because in a sense it's an empirical question. we're all theorists here. We could make schemas about the relationship between preschool education in Korea and getting a university degree in Brazil, and we could create links. But it's really empirical whether these links are simply the imagination of some theorist sitting in his or her office, or whether they are fundamental, basic issues which, at a deep level, tie educators together. And the one other thing that I would say, having sat through the conference so far, is that the answer cannot be just American, and yet education is very different in different parts of the world. When Harry Brighouse put up the 5 flourishes, I don't know whether he's still here or not, yes. I said, well, 4 of them don't make sense in most parts of the world. They're not ones that the educators or the society are as interested in. So we can't a priori make a decision that there's a central tendency which ties educators more closely to one another than they are to other professions, or for that matter, other non-professions, or what somebody called feminized professions, a word that used to be used, not used so more. But the only way to do that is actually to set up some tents, T-E-N-T-S, and put some stuff in the center, in the center ring, and see whether educators from different countries working with different ages and different roles do find that they have more in common with one another than they do with people who are in other professions and in other countries. And as I said to Mira's proud parents, I don't know that I'm going to be here to find out the answer, and God willing, they'll be here. But a lot of you will be here, and whether I'm in heaven or hell, please send me a wire.
Thank you very much, Howard, for that view on education and broader on comparative views from the professions. Now, the panelists wouldn't have noticed, but the auto-captioning went wrong. When Howard said we're all theorists, it read that we're all terrorists.
Well,
ChatGPT.
But right. I guess that's because we terrorize people with theory. We'll turn, though, to Ashley, who's going to take us a little bit into the future and tell us about an emerging field.
Yeah, that's a lot of heavy burden to live up to. So tech ethics is a nascent field compared to medicine or legal professions. It's just emerging. And so, I mean, just to tell you a little bit about myself, because it coincides with what I'm about to talk about. I'm a software engineer turned social scientist and educator. And one big area of my current research is around politics and ethics of technology, right? So I'm really interested in these questions around, how do we design ethical tech that actually centers experiences and concerns of young people and marginalized communities, which are often left out of these important conversations. And one big part of that question is, how do we educate, prepare next generation technologists for ethical work? So that is the topic of my talk, and I'm going to briefly talk about some of the emerging efforts, and we might even call it a movement to build ethical tech. This is important because, as you know, many have alluded to, there have been some very high-profile current affairs events that's been kind of rocking the tech ethics world and civil society more broadly. So let me just highlight some of those. As you know, in spite of the potentials of technology to advance public interest, recent events have really highlighted some of the challenges that technology has posed for democracy and civil society and the pursuit of truth, right, among others, both in terms of the design of technology as well as the ways in which they get used and deployed in different places. So for instance, think about the Cambridge Analytica scandal and the ways in which this private data firm kind of sort of illegally tapped into Facebook data, breached Facebook data, and used that data for behavioral political behavioral micro-targeting, right? So to meddle with the sort of behavior of voters during the 2016 US presidential elections. And it's not just US elections. If you kind of look at the history of Cambridge Analytica, it's meddled with other elections in different parts of the world as well, long before it surfaced in 2016 because of the US scandal. Social media platforms, because they prioritize the business model, because they prioritize engagement and clicks that come from sort of this kind of viral interaction, right? So content that really catches your eyes, that is kind of the basis of the commercial model that's kind of driving all of the commercial social media platforms today. So these platforms by design can capitalize on any sort of information that sells, and because of the way people also behave, and it's not just like a tech problem in that sense, misinformation and disinformation can spread like wildfires on social media and potentially undermine the healthy functioning of democracies, right? And sometimes the spread of hate speech, for instance, and disinformation has escalated to large-scale violence across the world, as we've seen in the Rohingya genocide, right? And movements like Black Lives Matter, they become targets of misinformation and disinformation campaigns, and activists who are involved in those movements as well, right? And human rights activists in particular, and other activists from minoritized communities, for instance, are very heavily targeted by this kind of misinformation and disinformation campaigns. And more recently, you might have also heard about facial recognition systems, which have come under scrutiny for its biases against darker skins, right? Because these systems get trained on large data sets, which primarily contain pictures of lighter-skinned individuals, right? So the computer algorithms have not been trained to recognize black and brown faces, for instance, right? And finally, more importantly, there are these concerns around black box algorithms and AI that make decisions that are increasingly affecting all aspects of our everyday lives, right? So from where we go to school, whether we can get a job or a loan for our housing, how much we pay for health insurance even, right? So these decisions are increasingly being made by machines rather than humans. So these are all some of the important questions that's been introduced into the world because of the rise of digital platforms. And increasingly, digital platforms are also used and incorporated by these different governments to sort of govern all aspects of citizen lives as well. So these are some pressing issues that we're facing in tech ethics. So as I mentioned, I started my career as a software engineer in Silicon Valley after studying computer science at Stanford. And when I was in college, many years ago, and I won't say how many years ago, tech ethics wasn't really a thing. So for the longest time, algorithms and technologies in general have predominantly been sort of evaluated and thought of in terms of their efficiency. Like, how do we design algorithms that perform tasks in the shortest possible time, right? So that has been like the key concern of computer scientists, and there was limited attention paid to other kinds of values, right? So, and biases that get embedded in tech products and processes, right? So these technological products are not value neutral, but they also reflect the values and biases of the creators and the culture in which these are produced, right? So the assumption that computer science as a field is value neutral, non-political field has kind of recently fallen flat in recent years, as demonstrated by these events that I just highlighted for you. And yeah, so you know, these show how every sort of decision we make in technology design and deployment is inherently political each design decision is political. The process of making and deploying technological products is political, right? So who is designing, right? Who is at the table? Who gets to design? Who gets to set the design agenda? These are all value-laden questions that are inherently political and raises difficult questions around the political power and ethical considerations and resource allocation. So until recently, as I said, there hasn't been a real formal training for computer scientists on social and ethical dimensions of computing. But this has changed very rapidly in recent years. There's now what we might even call a movement for ethical tech, and computer science departments around the country and also around the world have been introducing new computer science ethics curricula and initiatives, right? So for instance, Stanford started a computer science ethics program a couple of years ago. Harvard also has its own computer science ethics program, and my colleagues here from the Safra Center, Jess Minor, has been kind of leading some of the efforts around evaluating some of the effectiveness of those programs. And I would just like to wrap up by saying that when we think about tech ethics, it's not just about how individual technologists navigate ethical issues in workplace and what tools are needed, but it's also asking some of the bigger questions about workplace, for instance, and the workforce itself, right? So when you think about the workforce, right, are there enough diverse engineers who come from different backgrounds, right? So who are designing these different products. And also, thinking about the university to industry pipeline. So right now, sort of the default path is for computer science graduates to go right into industry or big tech corporations. So why aren't they considering these other more public interest-oriented options, right? So these are all very important questions that are very core to the questions we're asking in tech ethics right now, along with some of the macro level questions around, there's this very high concentration of power, right? In Silicon Valley, right? There are a few big tech corporations that are kind of globally exerting huge amounts of power, right? So how do we think about that how does that fit in with the ways in which we think about professional ethics? And I would like to argue here that universities have a big role to play in addressing some of these questions around both recruitment, retention, and training of professional engineers, as well as trying to reconfigure the whole political economy around how tech industry gets built and how it operates. So that's my short spiel, and I look forward to learning from other panelists about what's been done in other fields.
Right. Thank you, Ashley, for that view from tech ethics. Thank you. Folks, in session one, if I can take you back, we built a few sandcastles in the sky, imagining what it would be like if a teacher in a school could pick up the phone and if she were faced with an ethically problematic situation, dial a number and get an ethics consult, like they do in hospitals. But before we came on the session, Ashley, you and I were speaking, and you were saying, well, the situation isn't as rosy as all that in medical ethics. It's not perfect. Field doesn't have all of the answers. So can you sketch a few of the sort of moments of disquiet that people also have about how medical ethics has become institutionalized, how it's really practiced today?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the problem with bioethics as it's used in clinical ethics is different than as it's applied in research ethics. So in clinical ethics, I know, sorry, it keeps going in and out. If I have a consult, if I have a question, I'm not quite sure what to do with a patient, and there's a lot of concern at the bedside by me, the nurses, the family, we will call an ethics consult. And to me, the big issue is that not everyone understands what an ethics consult will do for you. So people will call an ethicist and say, this family wants to continue all life support. We feel that all medical intervention is futile at this time. how can you get us to tell the family to stop? Which is not really a great question to be asking of someone, because it kind of misses the point of an ethics consult. And so the issue is that you're trying to understand what the important questions are to ask. What are the values of this family? Why are they making the decisions they're making? What were the values of the person who can probably no longer speak for themselves? I mean, there's a lot to consider, but the ethics consult is not going to give you an answer. And so that is problematic. The other issue, which is not exactly what you were asking, but I'm going to say it anyway, is ethics, and I say this as a advice for this new field. Ethics in medicine is important, and I would say it is largely fully embraced as important. The physicians, nurses feel that it's important to learn about, they feel that it's important to inform their opinions, but it's still not valued in the kind of academic circles where it exists. So bioethicists, by and large, are unpaid. The majority of people who work in a bioethics consult service are paid $0. And so there are a handful, and I have some of them who are my friends, who are paid, but most people are volunteering their time. And that is also, and so there's the unpaid aspect. There's also the aspect that it's actually harder to be promoted if you're producing bioethical kind of literature and you're adding to the field. People think that's great, you're a nice person, but it's much harder to get promoted than if you are running a randomized controlled trial about some new cancer drug, because that's an easier thing. There's more metrics, right? Like you brought in X million dollars of grants, you did this study, it showed X, Y, Z, and then you wrote a big paper. That's easy to understand, to measure if you're a dean or you're someone else that's trying to understand how to promote someone. When you're doing research, honestly, in medical education or in bioethics, people don't really know what that means or what to do with it. And so it's both devalued in terms of your time. You're not given time to do, your clinical time is not purchased down to serve on the ethics committee. And it's also devalued in terms of your, how you're seen within the field. And so, and right now we're just talking about clinical ethics, but I would say for educational ethics, I don't know how promotion works within the educational realm or how kind of people's compensation works, but I would say it's really important for this to be taken seriously kind of from the beginning, that this is important and we value it. And we value it both kind of time-wise, monetarily, and kind of and ethically for what it means for the field as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And we were also talking about how hospital administrators see the role of the bioethicist, and you used an abbreviation, CYA.
Yeah, you know that one.
I've heard of it, yes.
Yeah, I mean,
I've used it.
CYA is cover your ass.
Yeah.
So that is, yeah, somewhat, if people may have decided they already know what they want to do. Sorry, keeps coming in and out, but they already know what they want to do, but they will ask for an ethics consult to kind of show that they asked the hard question, even though they're going to make the decision they're going to make anyway. That doesn't always happen. I feel like hospitals do encourage physicians to make the best decision they can possibly. But there are times when there really is no consensus that an ethics consult is brought in to show that we have asked the question, even though there's not really a great answer within the legal parameters of what we're trying to do. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that exactly brings us up to one of the things that David was speaking about, that how ethics in the legal realm is sort of black letter, and ethics sort of becomes law in a certain way. Does that ring a bell with you?
I just want to first just emphasize what you said is so important. If you're ethics, I think, listen, this is actually in the SAFRA Center. We have a lot of SAFRA alums. If you read Dennis's little blog there, that's the message from the original director. He says this, right, that it had become kind of a stepchild in every field. It was never thought of as being at the core. That's certainly true in law. And I think this is a part of a wider problem in the university, that the closer anything gets to practice or real life, the more devalued it is. Pure theory always is at the very top. And, I think that's true in almost every field. And ethics suffers from not just that it's actually grounded in practice, otherwise it doesn't, otherwise it's what Howard was talking about before, is just people dancing on the head of a pin, that it's just philosophy, sorry for the philosophers. But it's also almost inherently not subject to easy quantification. So now this is a way of leading to your point. So what's happened, it used to be that the lawyer's ethical code was like 13 canons like ecclesiastical canons that were printed, you could print on a card that people used to literally keep on their breast pocket, like the Bill of Rights or something like that. But of course, that was really hard to actually decide who was violating them, not violating them, what did they require, so they have become more and more rule-like over time, and the thing has become bigger and bigger, and now it looks a little bit like, not quite the Internal Revenue Code, but it has that structure. And the ultimate, sort of reductio absurdum of this is not only that the model rules of professional responsibility are many, many pages with many subsections, but that every student now has to take an ethics exam. You might say, oh, that sounds good, except it's like a multiple choice ethics exam, in which I never had to take it because they didn't have it when I was, back in the century. I was born in the last century, not the century before last, but still. But I wish I could say that I made this up, but I teach ethics, so I can't. But I hear very good advice on passing the exam it's four multiple choice answers. And when in doubt, always choose the second most ethical answer. The first most ethical answer is be Mother Teresa. That cannot be the ethics of the legal profession. And the last most ethical answer is, and keep the money too. You can't do that. So as between the second and third, the bar would rather think of itself as aspiring upward rather than slipping downwards. And the very fact that this is actually considered pretty good advice shows you what happens over time.
It's like picking the second most expensive bottle, the second cheapest bottle in the restaurant. But Howard, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I think that David is right that the mastery of ethics is not a high priority. But the statement you made about theory and conceptual stuff being valued the most, I wish that were still true, because the trends in this country of funding, particularly at public universities,
well, that's true.
If it's not totally useful right away, we're not interested.
No, that's a very good point.
Places with a lot of endowment may still show that kind of epistemological snobbery, but it's a trend going very quick in the opposite direction. And as Ashley says, we don't have the ethical concomitants of investing only in subject matters which have a payoff, which is certainly, it may be true in other countries. It's the norm now in this country, and it's very, very bad for the whole higher education sector.
Howard, if I can stay with you, we've heard about medicine and law, the history of the ethics institutional arrangements and some of the problems and pitfalls. But historically, why don't we have something like this in education already? Why did no one invent it at some point?
Well, somebody today, and I no longer have the names of the people this morning, but it was one of the first presentation, reminded us that until the 20th century in this country, all education was quite ethical and moral in its emphasis. I mean, Julie Rubin, I don't know if she's still here now, but basically chronicled the history of higher education in the United States, and we made a kind of a scientific bargain, if you will, about the beginning of the 20th century. We were going to lower moral and ethical concerns and look more into the German model of the university of the professors doing scholarship and in areas that we think is important. One of the reasons I jumped on the mention of values in college is that some of you know Wendy Fishman and I have done a big study of American colleges. And one of our biggest findings was something we never anticipated at all, and I was talking this morning to John about it, is a sense of mission is largely absent in American colleges and universities. And I would use Harvard as an example. If you spoke to, 150 undergraduates, you say, well, what's Harvard's mission? They might say veritas, they might say success, but it has nothing to do with what they do every day. And so one of the reasons our research group, and some people hear from it today, have become interested in ethics over the last 25 years is because we feel that the society has lost its way. We began with college. We're doing a lot of work in high school now. Danny from our team is here. I think Kirsten was here as well. And then this is meant to be to show you what happens to you at a certain point in life. I said, well, ethics doesn't begin in high school. It doesn't begin in college. It begins very early in life. I examined a study of what happens in Chinese, Japanese, and American preschools when active aggression occurs. And people who haven't read Joseph Tobin's book won't know that in the United States, people right away try to break the kids up. In China, they often go in that direction, but they focus more on academics. In Japan, they let the kids fight it out. And I would certainly trade American K through 12 with Japan every day. So this is the Howard Gardner part. We've decided, since we're interested in going from I to we call this the we project. We're actually studying early education because I think, and I bet you everybody in this room, if you think about it, most of you will realize that what you learned from your parents, from your neighborhood, from your early school, from your religion, in my case from the Boy Scouts, probably has a bigger effect on whether you pass David's ethical test than how many courses you took at Zafra or here.
Yeah.
So that early stuff is really important, and it is an educational issue, but it's not the same issue as who should get tenure in a department.
Yeah, and it probably also shows a few of the limits of what we're trying to do here. But I want to turn to Ashley quickly, because what's so distinctive about the tech ethics field is that it's sort of the ethical Wild West. I mean, the colonists are moving before the law can catch up with them, and you're kind of building the boat as it's at sea. What are some of the challenges around that, and how do people how do you do something like that in a systematic kind of way?
Save us.
Yes, right.
Well, I think everyone is expecting a ChatGPT in education example from me, so
We are.
Here it goes. So if you've been following, or if you have not been following ChatGPT conversations around education, that's been quite an alarm around, what is ChatGPT going to do to the ways in which learn and teach, and what does that mean for human intelligence, right? So some of the policy responses, so on the one extreme, you have places like New York City schools completely banning ChatGPT's use of students' use of ChatGPT for anything assignment related or schoolwork, basically, right? But then I guess the question we pose there, and this question has not been entirely worked out because we're trying to solve these issues as things are moving on. Technologies, evolve very rapidly. ChatGPT kind of like emerged out of nowhere, right? Not exactly out of nowhere, but like very rapidly. And students got onto using them even before adults were aware of them, or typically this is how it happens because young people are often at the forefront of technology use. They often become early adopters of these technologies even before any sort of policies or regulations can catch up, right? So that's sort of like where educators are kind of at the forefront of these changing fields, right? So, so I think the question that we're still trying to sort of work out is ChatGPT more like a calculator? Is it more like, do we kind of treat this as the invention of like a printing press, right? Or a calculator? So when calculator first came into what were introduced, there was huge alarm around, this is the end of, math, and, now students are not gonna be learning any math if teachers allow students to use them in the classroom, right? So, but that turned out to be kind of like misconstrued alarm, right? So, the skills that we emphasize in math classrooms have kind of changed, right? And the way we think about mathematical intelligence or mathematical competencies have also changed, right? So meanwhile, I think that there is, while some schools at Harvard have also banned ChatGPT use. For example, I think law school is one of them. I was just talking to a law student who was trying to use ChatGPT for his final exam, and then he got the email saying that ChatGPT is not allowed. So then I think in a recent poll taken at Stanford, like informal poll, nevertheless very informative, shows that the majority of Stanford undergrad students have actually used ChatGPT for their final exams. And I suspect that something like that is going on here at Harvard as well, right? So I think I also get a lot of questions from teachers and educators these days around, so what do I do with ChatGPT, right? Student use of ChatGPT. So I think these are really like difficult questions that we need to ask around, like the sort of like, what are the skills that we want to teach when we think about, future generation citizens and workers, and, what are the sort of things that we value, right? About what it means to be a human being, what it means to be part of our society. And I think these are sort of the questions that we really need to ask about, right? What ChatGPT is doing to humanity. And if we decide that it's not like, we're not going down the path to destruction as the initial alarm around the calculators have introduced, then we gotta figure out, how can students take advantage of tools like ChatGPT, and how do we train ChatGPT so that it's not trained essentially on sort of like generative AI, and things like ChatGPT don't get trained on biased data sets that are harmful to students who are actually using them, right? So, so like, for Google, for example, like if you kind of try, one of the sort of defining scholarship in our field is algorithms of oppression, where Google search engines, when you type in black girl, you get a bunch of like pornographic responses back from Google as search results at the top, right? And something like that is going on with ChatGPT as well today, because it's been trained on data set that's been primarily based on sort of the internet commercial data, right? So we do really need to think about sort of the ethics of what goes into kind of training these algorithms, but also thinking about what are the skills that we need to empower students with if we are to sort of empower students to be able to use these kind of new emerging technologies rather than just kind of disowning them, right, altogether. So these are very, very much like ongoing discussions in our field right now.
And tell us, Ashley, do you think there is a specific forum in which these discussions take place? I mean, do they take place in academia? Do they take place at academic conferences? Or are they going to take place in tech headquarters or in the tech press or whatever? Who is going to have these discussions? And are they going to be sort of bottom up from users and programmers? Or are they going to be top down from industry leaders or industry academics? How do you see it unfolding?
Well, I would say there are many different kinds of players right now. So when I say tech, I kind of talked about computer science because it's sort of my initial discipline. But when I say tech, there are tech policymakers, right? There are lawyers, cyber lawyers, like Howard said. There are social scientists working on tech. There are internet scholars working on tech, right? So social scientists, humanities scholars, computer scientists, engineers. It's a very sort of an interdisciplinary field, right? But that said, there are sort of pockets, even within Harvard, where scholars gather to talk about tech ethics, emerging tech ethics issues. There are emerging professional organizations that are dedicated to tech ethics. There are convenings and networks that are sort of really invested in talking about tech ethics. On the other side of that is corporations setting up tech ethics offices. But a lot of it is also kind of like PR, right? Managing the public perceptions and trying to manage governance and regulations from kind of falling hard upon the industry, right? So there are a lot of competing forces within tech ethics. And some people talk about like corporate capture of ethical tech movement, right? So there are, we also talk about sort of the ethics washing where corporations are investing large amounts of money into these university-led tech ethics program, and therefore have like huge influence in how tech ethics education is carried out, right? So there are very, this is why I like to call it a movement in part, because there are a lot of competing forces, both internally and externally, that are actively shaping how this field is sort of turning out. Like a movement, it's going to be, we don't really know the end, right?
But I know. But just for clarity, you do think is there a standard nomenclature? Is there a standard word? It's called...
There isn't even a standard word around tech ethics. Yeah. Actually, tech ethics is a very contested term.
Right. Well,
so people will call it different things, right?
Yeah.
Some people really don't like the ethics, as a term, right? So, people who are really emphasizing sort of the empirical basis of, everyday ethical practices, they will often call it something else, right? Yeah. So, for instance, there are terms like public interest tech, right? So tech that serves public interest, but there's also a big debate around what that actually means. Yeah. Some people call it community tech, kind of emphasizing the ways in which technology gets really embedded. Ethical technology should be embedded in communities and individuals who are actually using them, right? So, without one name, is it one movement? Yeah, but there is no one name.
As everyone was talking, I'm going to throw this sort of an open question to the whole group. It is striking that your origin stories of where the ethics codes and movements came from were all embedded in scandals, in World War II, in Watergate, in Cambridge Analytica. But isn't that an extremely depressing thing? Doesn't that just say that as a field, we're just reacting? We're just catching up. We're just putting a sticking plaster on past wrongdoing. Is that the best that we can hope for?
I mean, Katie? I think it's a little depressing in terms of its origin story, but I think it was Howard who was talking about mission. I think that current generations expect more from their leaders, their educators, their leaders, like people who are in charge of forming their life. The police. I mean, everyone. They expect more, and they're more. It's more okay to state out loud that you expect more, and so It is depressing that that's the origin story, but I do feel hopeful about the future because I think that current generations are unwilling to let corruption slide. They're unwilling to let their educators not educate in the best way they can. And so, I don't know. I mean, in medicine, Amir and I were talking about this before this panel. The thing to me that I think is going to be the most confusing right now is that I think medical schools and basic medical education is in a pretty good place in terms of teaching bioethics, but I think the part that gets confusing is when the other place where medical learners really learn medicine is in hospitals during these residency training programs. And those are different institutions, right? Those are hospitals that are businesses. And so they have different missions than the medical schools where people just came from, or where the medical students currently still are, but they're doing their clinical rotations in these hospitals. And the hospitals may say they have these missions, but whether or not they live up to them or actually believe in them, it's not really clear to me because they are businesses. And so they're different than academic institutions. And so I think to me that's the most kind of confusing part for learners. But I do have hope that learners are going to say, like, listen, Boston Children's Hospital or MGH or whatever, you say your mission is this and you are not doing it. And until you live up to it, I'm not going to accept this kind of
there's no reason why we couldn't also
I think
more.
The future is better. Despite the fact that ChatGPT terrifies me.
David, scandals.
So first of all, I mean, people always react to scandals, and they also always overreact to them. I maybe to both what Katie and Howard said, I think that we are afraid of asking what the mission of anything is anymore. I mean, in many ways. So on the one hand, it's not just the students. If you went around and asked the faculty in my law school, what's the mission of Harvard Law School? When I was a student, actually, you could get a very, very coherent answer to that about what we were teaching, why we were teaching, how it related to the world, why it was good, whatever. The problem is most of what we thought, we actually don't believe anymore for many good reasons. But nobody's willing to actually, so then it's let 1,000 flowers bloom, and there's no actual, because it's too hard to actually sit and figure out what the mission ought to be. That's the first thing. The second thing I'd say, I agree with you about, Katie, about the disjunction between what gets taught in school and what gets done at work. But I think the answer to that is not to say you should take what you learned at school and then take it to work. Because the problem is the dynamics of the workplace are important too. So this is back to my is-ought. This is back to sociology. This is back for an argument that unless we understand what professionalism means in a market, then it's never going to actually have grit in the real world. We have set up professionalism and ethics as the antithesis of the market, and that was fine when we had monopolies on the markets and doctors could tell people what they wanted to tell them, and we didn't tell you were sick because it would worry your little pretty head, or that lawyers would mumbo Latin mumbo jumbo and do whatever they want. But actually in a world where ChatGPT, whatever else it's going to do, is reducing information asymmetry dramatically between buyers and sellers and between professionals and those they serve, and in which, unless we are going to dramatically reconfigure the world in which we live in, we're going to live in a market economy, we better think what professionalism and ethics mean in a market setting. And that means teaching aspiring professionals and those who they serve how the market and the institutions and the structures and the incentives actually work, and how we ought to think about what inevitably will be the trade-offs, because that's what life in the real world is all about.
Yeah. We're going to go to questions in a minute, but I want to let Howard come in, seeing as he has a point on.
You actually may want to weigh in as well. 3 points. One, while I think it's an interesting hypothesis that our intention to things comes from scandals, I think you could probably make an equal argument they just come from new stuff, good and bad. The second point relates to what David just saying. You put markets up there on a pedestal. That's a very British-American view. I'd like to know what they say in China and Brazil and India and the 21st century countries. They would have a different story to tell. Where I'm pleased that I find myself on the same page as Ashley, because we we worked together and taught together some years ago, is I think this is really the first time, certainly in my life, that we really are challenging what it means to be a human being. Mm-hmm. Because everything else before, we could kind of handle. But, I read I've never done ChatGPT, but I read everything about it, and it's like nothing that we ever envisioned before. We used to call it science fiction. It's not anymore. And as you all know, once decisions become downloaded, it's just no way of knowing what those decisions are going to be. And if different countries have different versions, that's even worse. So my last act in education is returning to what it means to be a human being, what it means to be at the end of the Anthropocene era. Is there going to be another era? Are we going to be around at all? Yeah. And it could be that that's and this does relate to this conference. It could be much more about kind of human beings we want to be, and less whether we can calculate quickly or write as well as famous writers.
But you should take an hour, Howard. Honestly, it's a great game. Try it. I asked ChatGPT and a philosophical question, and I think they gave me an answer that to me sounded like a first-year student who was just repeating a few things they'd heard in a lecture. But I asked ChatGPT, now give me a more complicated answer, now give me a more wordy answer, and actually ChatGPT stepped up a bit. It's a great game. Why don't we
add one thing?
Oh yeah, sure. We're going to definitely move to pair conversations. Yes. But Ashley, come in on that really quickly.
Yes, I just wanted to kind of echo what Howard said about education should be sort of about what it means to be human, right? Mm-hmm. We need to think about what it means to be human against in the context of these. Emerging technologies and the ways in which individuals and communities and society are getting reconfigured. And I think that often in education, so far, at least in universities, there's been a lot of emphasis on sort of the critique and sort of the deconstructing, what's wrong. But there's a lot less emphasis on actually the solutions part, right? So if you are to think about a different world, what does that world look like, right? So right now, a lot of the scholarship in tech ethics kind of focuses on, critiquing and deconstructing technologies that don't work. But we also need to actively educate young people and next generation engineers, citizens, policymakers about what is the world that we actually want. And when I say we, it's a pluralistic we, right? Mm-hmm. There, right now, a lot of the sort of the values infusing Silicon Valley and some of these big tech corporations are primarily Western, based on dominant Western values, right? So what does it mean to kind of bring in these other perspectives and encourage kind of different economies that can contribute to the creation of this pluralistic, different value-based AI and other technologies. So I think that's an important next step that we need to be headed as a teachers and educators.
Thank you, Ashley. Please turn to the person next to you and have a quick discussion about questions that you'd like to ask the panel and observations, and then feel free to go to the mics to ask some questions of our panel. We'll give a minute and a half or so for conversation and some questions building. So I'd like to go to that mic over there. If you could just say your name, introduce yourself really briefly, and then the question, please.
Sure, thank you. Hello, thank you so much for being here and for this conversation today. My name is Georgina. I'm a current master's student, and I'll be a future doctoral student here at the Ed School starting in the fall. And my question for the panelists is, how do you grapple with ethical models or systems privileged among experts or theorists in your respective fields, possibly differing from those of either practitioners in the field or recipients receiving services from your fields?
Yeah. Thank you. We've definitely heard the question about the theory-practice gap before, but maybe the consumer practitioner or the client practitioner gap is one that we haven't really thought much before. Does anyone have any opening thoughts on that?
Well, I'll just say that this is part of the challenge of teaching professional ethics in a professional school. I mean, we almost never, here medicine, at least your students are out with clients. We have clinical education in the law schools, but there's the clinics almost operate as a world in and of themselves, so maybe this is a little what you were saying. I think certainly the perspective of the patient, the client, and not just the patient and the client, and this is where I think, ethics more broadly in philosophy comes in, because you have to think about the effects on society and the world. I mean, I think that's what you were saying about text. So the problem with professional ethics is that it often becomes very narrowly professional, which means it often becomes very narrowly professional self-interest. And getting out of that box without disputing that there is something about being a professional is, I think, one of the big challenges.
And Katie, what do you think about the possible situation? Your patient thinks differently about the ethics of the situation than you. But a doctor, will you please prescribe me X?
Right. Yeah. I mean, well, I was thinking about it in terms of both. Because I think, all professions are made up of humans, right? And so they will have differing opinions. And you'll have medical students who say, like, listen, I went into medicine because it's going to pay me well, and I want to go into private practice, dermatology in the LA hills, and what is wrong with that? And I don't know, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's not, it's a little bit, it seems different than what you're teaching in traditional medical ethics classes about treating vulnerable patients, et cetera. But that's nothing wrong. And so my point is that you will have practitioners who have different feelings about how stringently they need to, how broadly they need to apply these ethical principles. Is it just to their individual interaction with one patient, or is it to what they owe humanity and society as someone who practices a caring profession, or as an attorney, or someone who develops tech, et cetera? And so there's that. And then with an individual patient, that one to me actually is a little bit easier, because that is what bioethics really is much more for. It's really understanding people's values. So there's certain principles that we should all adhere to as clinicians, but how you apply those principles to one individual patient or that person's family really depends on where they come from, what has informed their view, what are the constraints on whether or not they're able to tell you their view and whether or not you can elicit it. And then, so I actually find it easier to think about where you disagree with the patient as opposed to what your mission in life is as a clinician. Those are, it's just easier to, it's not actually as complicated.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go to the mic over there.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is connected.
Oh, hello. If you say your name quickly.
My name is Maya Al-Katib Shami, and I'm a doctoral student here at the School of Ed. There was a question, a useful discussion at the end of the previous panel about the comparison between ideal and non-ideal theory and what are we to use as a framework for thinking. But at the end of Dr. Given's presentation, there was a question that wasn't really addressed, which is, what if there are two ideal theories out there? Either because there are two value systems at play. Think about like prioritizing the individual versus the group interest, for instance, as an easy one, or because the justice for two different groups is incommensurable. What is good for one group is actually at odds with what is good for another group. So looking at the different professional fields that you're familiar with, what is the role of the ethicist in situations like this? Is it to, kind of do some of the thinking and just say, these are all the options and pros and cons of different things? Is there a standard that someone should strive to achieve? Do they have a role to be explicit on what value system they're using themselves? Because maybe they are not. Yeah, I'd love to hear your reaction.
Yeah, let's go to Howard first, and then maybe. So, what do you think, Howard, about the role of the ethicist? Is it to lead us into the one promised land, or just lay out the various paths that we can take?
My answer is yes. Yeah, no, I do think to the extent that you can clarify, that's already. For people who are listening, that's a big advantage. Sometimes you have to kind of put your scale on one side, put your finger in one side of the scale rather than the other. But one idea which I associate with Danielle Allen's analysis of democracy, but I think it's a closer analysis of the workplace. You want to feel that the next time something comes up, you're going to get a fair shake. And that it's not the finger isn't always going to be in one side of the scale, which I think is also what Ashley was talking about. But many of these dilemmas do not have a solution that's going to satisfy both, and so you have to take a meta role and not only make that clear, but say that there is another day. And to the previous question, I would just add, it's very important when you switch from being a master's student to a doctorate student that you don't expect, that suddenly the curriculum is going to be different or the teaching is going to be different. I think the real difference is the mentoring. And my guess is anybody here who's gone through training, has learned much more from mentors, anti-mentors, tormentors, and fragmenters, 4 words that I've used, than from the courses that they take.
Thanks. It's a complicated question. I think we'll keep the questions rolling, and if the questioners can keep them succinct.
Yeah, and so the question is there anything worth mentioning about the role of professional associations and accrediting agencies in the creation and updating and teaching of these codes? And if there is anything worth saying about that, what significance does it have for the enterprise of education ethics?
Yep, thank you very much, Randall. And I'm sure the professional associations have had. I mean, you've explained how the sort of World Health Organization grew out of an ethical sort of endeavor. But in the developing field, that kind of takes us back to that question I asked about what forum is this discussion going to take place in? So do people have thoughts about professional associations, and then bringing it home to education specifically? Which professional association, and how are we going to get them to take the enterprise seriously? I'll throw it open to who wants to answer.
I'll just say that I'd love to hear what you say about. I'd say most of certainly in my field, the professional associations are completely captured by the self-interest of professionals. And so therefore they are mostly not where the interesting discussion happens, but the question of how to create a forum, this goes back to the previous question, in which the voices of those who get affected by the profession are there. And I'd be curious in the tech field how they're thinking about this, since so much of this is so complicated. Yeah, and no one, as far as I understand, actually even knows how ChatGPT actually works in the black box of it. I mean, how do you think about creating? That's the question you asked before.
Very briefly, Ashley, any thoughts? Professional associations?
I mean, in computer science, we have ACM, which is Association for Computing Machinery, and they recently come up with a code of conduct along with a number of other related associations. I think they do have an important role to play in terms of kind of guiding the professionals in what sort of work they should be doing and not be doing. But I think, like you, David, you said, it's there's always kind of the question around corporate capture, right? So computer science has very close ties to, Silicon Valley, for instance, very close ties to, I mean, basically like the whole capitalism, right? Like, how do we dissociate capitalist interest of the field itself from, right? So,
if I can go to Howard, are we going to walk over to the president of AERA and they're going to welcome us with open arms and give us a big platform?
I'm going to dredge up a a term which I haven't thought of in years, invisible colleges. There are people who have values and they share them, but they don't promulgate them, and they try to move the field in a positive direction. They don't always succeed. I remember asking these questions of Ethan Zuckerman, who's one of the giants in computing, and this was way before, this is 10, 15 years ago. He said, well, there's already people who have tremendous power in computing, and they're the ones who decide which connections should be made and which shouldn't be made on something which I wouldn't understand at all. And I think we need to rely as much on the people with consciences who don't lose their conscience than we do with associates, because I agree with David. They feel a need to continue to exist, and that runners, and that's not a criticism of AERA particularly, but just it's the
Thank you, Howard.
Yeah.
Very
fast, very fast. So I think they are really important. They do certainly love to self-govern, and professional associations have their own interest at heart. But I would say in medicine, so I think it depends who's in charge of them, right? Who's at the very top, and also who's right below. Because in medicine, there are a lot of, there's like the larger medical organizations like the AMA, but there's also smaller ones like ACOG, the American College of OBGYNs, who have a lot of really prominent ethical statements about how to think about various things with relation to reproductive health, and they hold a lot of sway within their communities. But it's because the people who are writing these are the ones who are interested in this, and so they have kind of put themselves at the top. And then the other thing, just related, I would say also, and again, I don't know the education literature, but is also who's the editor-in-chief of your major journals, and what are they deciding to publish, and what types of sections do they have within their journals? Like that, to me, they're kind of related entities, but those, I think they have a big part to play, but it depends. I think it's important that people who are interested in this put themselves in positions of power.
Mm-hmm. Now, that clock tells me we've got 3 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is to ask the 3 questioners to ask their questions one after the other, and then we'll give the panel one round of answers. So over to you, sir, very briefly. Please.
Thank you. Could anyone in the panel talk about professional ethics education, and whether you can imagine forms of education that would actually be harmful? So I think to some extent you talked about the CAY approach, you talked about the 2-credit course. Are there ways in which trying to do good, we might actually do harm by
unforeseen consequences? Over there.
Okay, my question is for Ashley. So you were talking about the different buckets you might find ethicists in now, and one of them is like in the university, people are embedding ethics across the curriculum, and like computer scientists maybe have to take ethics courses. But like I'm really struck by the difference between lawyers and doctors and teachers. Like you have to have a certain kind of certification. And like my sense is that a lot of people who are real movers and shakers in the technology world have just like a self-taught or study math or physics or whatever. So does that make you think that there's kind of a real limitation on tech ethics at the university, and there should really be more, like the real potential is in civil society and government and other things that I can't think of?
Thank you. And then we have one last question. You're very welcome.
Thanks. I was really interested in, for all of you, this morning I heard raised a really provocative proposal of only folks who are qualified as educators should speak about certain issues in educational ethics. And I was interested in the question of, to what extent, looking especially at legal and medical ethics, should we like or dislike the idea that people who speak about ethics in a role need to occupy that role, and or that the morality of the role needs to come out of something. People talk about the internal morality of medicine, for instance, as opposed to those ethical norms coming from societal values that might come from sources exterior to the role or to the profession itself.
That's a great question about role morality. So I'll give every panelist an open mic on any of these questions.
Ashley, do you want to start?
You had one directed right to you.
Yeah.
Self-taught techie.
No, I think actually that's a really great question, and if you're a student, a PhD student, potential dissertation material there. But I think what you're pointing to is sort of the many paths that students can take into and out of computer science, right? So if you look at me, I got no college ethics education per se, but I think that I managed to have mentors who made a difference in my day-to-day work, right? So who could, I mean, and a lot of it is also about, like, you know, when you're trying to make career decisions about, you know, is this field aligned with the values that I carry, what I want to be as an individual, how I want to contribute to society. So I think those questions are, you know, I mean, even in computer science ethics education as it exists today, a lot of it, I mean, some of the things that we've found on different campuses, and Jess might have some thoughts on this too as well, is that students have a hard time actually transferring what they've learned inside the classroom to the actual workplace, right? So there's this sort of the practice and theory gap, like we've discussed before, and I think that, you know, people get different kinds of you know, entryways into thinking about ethics, right? But I agree with sort of, I think that's what you were suggesting, is that education could potentially have a bigger role in helping students navigate those complex decisions, right?
Thanks,
that you have to make as a worker and a citizen.
Thank you. And we're over our allotted time, but does anyone have a quick way to answer some of the other questions about unexpected consequences, or whether you have to be if you're going to be talking about flying, then you have to be a pilot first?
I want Howard to go last, so I'm just because he's always the most interesting. So I'll just say law doesn't belong only to lawyers, but there's always a role for an insider perspective and an outsider perspective. It partly depends upon the question that we have, but I think it's a mistake to think of a world in which only those people, particularly who are certified, back to the question that somebody said before, licensed and certified, which is a whole other level of regulation of the state, are able to speak on certain issues.
And I would just say, you know, in terms of the way that educational ethics could potentially cause harm, I think if it's treated as a field where there are multiple choice answers, that could do harm. You know, that there is no one right answer, and so the point is that it's meant to be a discussion and ongoing, not just something that you learn in medical school or law school or educational school, et cetera.
Howard, last words.
That's a great point. Yeah, a number of the questions talked about creating organizations, and that took me back to de Tocqueville, whom you all know, said this is the country of organizations, and Robert Putnam, who says, you know, you need to have organizations. His new movie is called Join or Die. But organizations can be very pathological. And there's the founder syndrome, and there's syndrome of passing on the knowledge and who gets the baton. People who are in here, you know, recently I've spoken about Project Zero, the group that we have Tina here and Danny here, maybe some other people. It's up to other people to decide whether Project Zero is a healthy organization, but it's existed for 55 years through 5 leadership transitions, and so far haven't gone to jail for it. But it's not something that happens by accident. And I think the reason I was cynical about organizations is because they almost always go over to people who want, for running things is the most important thing, rather than taking something that's sacred and trying to keep it that way and make it better. And that's a charge to Mira and her offspring.
Thank you. Colleagues, apologies for intruding on your time longer than 1:45, but join me in thanking the panel. Thank you.
As the panel gets off the stage, I just want to ask you to give yourselves a round of applause. This is a really long day, and so thank you. That's a lot of attentiveness, and I really want to thank our IT team and our EdEthics team. Sorry? And our Zoom audience, yes. Thank you so much.